1913. Phantom UFO Wave. In the early months of 1913, long before the concept of UFOs entered the public consciousness under that name, a peculiar phenomenon swept across the skies of Britain and echoed in the newspapers of the United States. Citizens reported large, silent airships moving at night, hovering, turning, and disappearing without explanation. Dubbed the Phantom Airship Wave, the episode reflects a moment when the possibilities of flight met the anxieties of looming warfare, and where newspapers amplified both wonder and fear. Though Delaware was not at the center of this event, the state's press and public were nevertheless touched by the wave. Local newspapers reprinted stories, readers wrote letters, and the notion of airships overhead entered the local imagination. For Delaware's aerial mystery history, the 1913 wave is a critical piece of context. It explains how earlier reports of strange lights or craft might have been interpreted, and how the state's media environment became attuned to what would later become UFO sightings. The phenomenon itself. The British Isles experienced the surge of reports between late 1912 and early 1913. Historian Brett Holman describes how thousands of Britons claimed to see large airships at night, machines so advanced that they could not plausibly exist given the era's technology. Conservative newspapers in Britain tied the scare ship reports to fears of German aerial invasion, spying, and the changing nature of warfare from the air. The wave included sightings of cigar-shaped craft, searchlights scanning the terrain, and lights moving at speeds impossible for the known airships of 1913. While most concentrated in Britain, echoes of the wave appeared in the United States as well, especially through syndicated newspaper items and letters from readers reporting unusual lights. Though direct USA documentation is thinner. Researchers note that the general pattern of unexplained aerial sightings in early 20th century America shares common behavior with the 1913 wave. Silent lights, dirigible-like shapes, and reports of machines hovering or scuttling off into the darkness. Why Delaware matters. So why does Delaware figure in this narrative, if only tangentially? First, because the national press syndication machine of the era meant that Delaware newspapers were likely to reprint British stories or USA re-reports of the airship wave. That exposure shaped local readers' mental models of what an airship could be, priming them to interpret lights overhead through the language of dirigibles. Second, the state's agricultural and semi-rural communities, with open skies and minimal aviation noise, were fertile ground for anomalous sighting reports, especially in a time frame when heavier-than-air flight was still rare. Third, local press retrospectives cite the wave when discussing early Delaware aerial scares. The wave thus helps researchers understand why Delaware's early press items, perhaps brief, second-hand, and lacking full detail, should still be considered part of the same cultural continuum that led to later UFO sightings. Social impact and public reaction. In Britain, the wave caused genuine concern. The idea that a foreign power could be conducting aerial reconnaissance shocked many, and newspapers urged readers to remain vigilant. The fear of invasion from the air was new and disconcerting. In the United States, and by extension Delaware, the effect was more subtle but pervasive. The public saw reports of mysterious craft, felt the novelty of aviation technology, and gained a heightened interest in lights and machines in the sky. In Delaware papers, editorials and letters referenced airships seen in many states, or strange lights over the coast, all in the context of national alarm about aerial threats or inventions. Although many of these items remained brief and second-hand, cumulatively they established a local culture of aerial noticing. In many ways, the 1913 wave represents a transitional moment between 19th century balloonism and the modern UFO era. Balloons and dirigibles were still familiar, but heavier-than-air machines and night flight possibilities were new. The notion that a machine could silently cross vast distances at night was astonishing. Delaware readers accustomed to steamboats, railroads, and steamships now faced the possibility of something that flew above them, and yet did so invisibly and silently. This mismatched innovation and perception often triggered reports of hovering lights or airships that shouldn't exist. Once the wave subsided by mid-1913, newspapers grew skeptical, and many stories were retrospectively attributed to Venus, meteors, or electrical phenomena. The impact lingered. For Delaware, the memory of airships overhead or fishermen reported odd lights. They had at least one cultural model. Perhaps this was a machine, a wandering dirigible, a spy craft, or something else entirely. Notable people and institutions. While specific Delaware individuals tied directly to the 1913 wave remain hard to identify, no major public figure from Delaware published a detailed investigation at the time. The editors of regional newspapers merit mention. For instance, Wilmington area papers reprinted syndicated stories from the eastern seaboard and often published readers' letters about nocturnal lights. Those editors mediated the wave's entry into Delaware's public consciousness. Additionally, later historians and newspaper retrospectives in Delaware cite the 1913 wave when discussing early aerial scares in the state, thereby acknowledging its influence. In the British context, figures such as Lord Northcliffe, owner of the Daily Mail, actively used the airship reports to argue for stronger aviation defenses. That same tone of national aviation anxiety is mirrored in Delaware's smaller-scale aeronautical culture. When later aircraft demonstrations or early local flights occur, for example the 1910 Delaplane flight over Wilmington, they exist in the same milieu of elevated attention to the skies. Legacy and relevance today. Understanding the 1913 Phantom airship wave is crucial for several reasons. For one, it demonstrates how public expectation and newspaper coverage can shape the interpretation of aerial events. In Delaware's early 20th century sky, when someone reported a hovering light or unidentified craft, they lacked modern radar, aviation charts, or AF/UFO protocols, but they did have a cultural script, the airship. Because the script existed, even ambiguous lights could be cast as machines, dirigibles, or spies. Second, the wave helps explain why many Delaware aerial mystery reports in the decades. That followed may not have been modern UFOs in the sense of extraterrestrial craft, but they still mattered. They show how ordinary observers described unusual lights in the sky, and how their descriptions were shaped by what they thought aerial phenomena could be. In a sense, Delaware's early UFO-type sightings are part of a long continuum, beginning with balloon shows, airship scares, early planes, and finally modern UAP reports. Third, the wave highlights the role of regional press in establishing a culture of aerial watching. Delaware's newspapers may have carried only a few syndicated stories, but to local readers these were signals. Look up, pay attention. The skies are not just for birds. That change in attention is part of the foundation of UFO culture in the state. In contemporary times, when researchers dig through Delaware's archives and come across a 1912 or 1913 newspaper item about a machine with lights flying over the coast, they now know to situate it in this wave of national anxiety. It also helps book writers frame Delaware's UFO history, not as isolated sightings only after Roswell, but as part of an evolving public awareness of aerial oddities that stretches back more than a century. Conclusion: while the 1913 Phantom airship wave may have taken place far from Delaware's quiet fields and coastal shores, its influence did reach the state in subtle but meaningful ways. The stories of silent airships, unknown machines floating overhead, and public alarm about aerial spying filtered into Delaware's newspapers and into the minds of local observers. It primed a generation of residents to notice not just what flew, but what they thought might be flying. And when later decades brought strange lights over Delaware's skies, the legacy of 1913 provided both a framework for interpretation and a cautionary tale about how the imagination can fill the gaps in what we see above us. For the contemporary reader, and for the writer of Delaware's UFO story, it is a reminder that the history of aerial phenomena is not only about what was seen, but about what was expected to be seen. In that sense, the phantom airships of 1913 still hover quietly over Delaware's sky-watching tradition.